And I think as we enter the election period, there ought to be a bit of onus placed on the coalition to state clearly, unequivocally, where they stand.
Senator, can I ask you about that $375 million?
Yep.
Because just going backwards to December, that was the first time it ever happened that $375 million went from one budget to another. Now you're confirming it's happening again in this next financial year. Can you explain exactly how that money will be spent once it goes to immigration? What will it be spent on?
Well, first of all, it's being capped.
Yes,
That's the important point, and it's being spent on the sustenance of asylum seekers who end up on Australian soil. For this reason, supporting them here is exactly the same principle as supporting them in a refugee camp with blankets and food and child protection, emergency accommodation, medical services, somewhere else. The principle's the same, and that's why the OECD guidelines, the guidelines that govern how nations can categorise their aid, what they can count as aid and what they can't count, those OECD guidelines contemplate governments using a proportion of their aid budget for onshore refugee sustenance. And that's why countries with very substantial reputations like Norway, Sweden, the United States use proportions of their aid budget to support onshore refugee sustenance. When it comes to how we do in comparison with other OECD nations, we're about the middle. We're about the middle when it comes to the investment of ODA funds in onshore refugee support.
And is PNG and Nauru still exempt from that?
Yes, yes.
Senator Carr, after you confirmed last December that $375 million has been diverted in the OECD's Development Assistance Committee's recent review, it said that that decision resulted in a shift of spending within the overall ODA budget, which led to a decrease of $255 million for AusAid's programming. What's the impact of this going to be on AusAid programming? Isn't it going to have another?
It's too early to say, but it is a reprioritisation, and we're committed to supporting people brought here who claim asylum seeker status. There wouldn't be an eyebrow raised if the money were going to supporting them in a refugee camp somewhere in the region.
What programs?
It's too early to say.
Why is it that Britain can continue its march towards 0.7% of GNI?
Well, we'll see how Britain goes. We'll see how Britain goes given the pressures on the British budget. But across the OECD, across the 24 nations of the OECD, the average cut has been 4%. We're not cutting. We're increasing. We're increasing by 9.6%. Despite all the pressures on the budget, despite all the contraction of revenues, we're managing two things: to increase the budget on aid by 9.6%, a pretty respectable figure, and second, to cap the amount within that aid budget that goes legitimately, altogether legitimately, on the sustenance of asylum seekers on Australian soil.
Senator, under this cap, are you prepared to provide a breakdown of what
We're prepared to provide exactly what we provided last year.
Australia campaigned quite heavily during its bid for the UN Security Council that we say we do what we say we do internationally, and we also are a leader in the region. What do you say to international communities, and particularly in our own region, who feel cheated by this?
They don't. I haven't had a single conversation in all my travels, in all my engagement with foreign ministers, with presidents, prime ministers. I haven't encountered anything except support, encouragement and gratitude for Australia's big commitment on overseas aid.
But surely this will mean that some programs in our own region will be slashed.
Again, our aid budget is going up. The aid budget is going up. We're doing more in the region, not less in the region. The aid budget's increasing, and as a result, there are more people being helped to decent nutrition, to attendance at birth, lowering the rate of maternal death, increasing the level of child support, and sustaining hundreds of thousands of more students throughout their schooling. That's a very good outcome. Given the pressures on the budget, given the contraction in revenues, this is an extraordinarily good outcome.
Mr. Carr, can we just talk for a minute about now that graph line of increasing the funding?
Yep.
It's now been pushed out 2 years later
Yes.
than the original
Yep.
plan to reach 0.5% of GNI. Can you explain to us and to everyone else who wants to know in the community what is going to be the impact of that? Because AusAid itself had been gearing up all of its resources towards this increase. All the aid agencies
what that
will
means,
happen? What amounts are we talking about?
what that means is that we are going to be increasing our aid, but not at the rate we had hoped.
Can you talk about the
Not at the
amounts,
rate we had
please?
hoped in economically more buoyant times. As we did last year, we'll provide all those details. It'll be publicly available.
How do recipients provide long-term outcomes if they can't tell year to year how much money they're getting? How do you create growth and change?
Well, the alternative would be to borrow money to spend on overseas development assistance, and that's simply not sustainable.
Senator Carr, Costello says his decision will cost lives, thousands of lives.
But he could just as logically say that not doubling the aid budget costs lives. I mean, you can play that game endlessly. You can say not borrowing $10 billion to spend on overseas development costs lives. You can't spend money you haven't got. You can't spend money you haven't got. You can't borrow money to sustain an aid budget. With a dramatic contraction in Australian revenues caused by a drop in profits, caused in turn by the high value of the Australian dollar, the government's got to face hard choices. But this is, given those pressures, to actually deliver an increase in the aid budget of 9.6% and to say, yes, we're going to cap the amount going altogether legitimately on the sustaining of asylum seekers who arrive on Australian soil is a very good outcome. And behind the obligatory and altogether understandable criticism made by members of the aid community who wanted us to get, I endorse their aspiration altogether, to that 0.5% faster, there was an implicit or explicit understanding that capping that amount was a good thing, and in these difficult circumstances, actually increasing the aid budget was a very good thing.
Will any countries be particularly affected by this change?
No, you can't say that. You can't say that. Our commitment.
Is there not an answer?
Yeah, no. Well, as I think I've said this 3 times now. In the way we did last year, we'll provide full details, country by country.
When will that be on budget night or not? Each country by country.
I think last year we provided it within a couple of weeks. Yeah.
How do you think the deferral looks overseas, though, particularly for the Prime Minister, who's...
There's only one. As the rest of the world sees it, Australia is a very generous donor. Australia is in the front ranks of donor countries. No one sees it any other way. And countries recognise, don't forget, across the OECD, there's been an average 4% reduction in aid, an average 4% reduction in aid. They look at Australia and it's up 9.6%. That only invites a generous assessment.
Senator Carr, under this cap money that's diverted, are you clear on who has accountability for that spend? There seemed to be some confusion in the estimates process earlier this year about who is responsible. Is that DIAC? Is that AusAid? Who is responsible for that spend?
Well, AusAid doesn't administer the onshore processing, the sustenance of refugees. I don't know why there'd be confusion about that.
So who is responsible?
So who's responsible?
Who is responsible for
the Department of Immigration. There's never been any state secret about
Senator
that.
Carr, report after report has identified the need for Australia to open more overseas postings because our diplomatic footprint isn't big enough. Yet you're cutting postings. What's the rationale?
Well, we're closing one, Budapest, because we can
And
serve it.
abandoning plans for
We
another.
can serve it. We can serve it from 2 other postings, Warsaw and Vienna. But hang on, that is to enable us to build a big new diplomatic establishment in Nairobi and to give us a strongly fortified embassy in Kabul, which will be required after the events of 2014. Moreover, we're proceeding with the opening of the embassy in Senegal, which will end up with an Australian ambassador based there. The Hungarian post is one of our smallest in Europe. Diplomatic staff at the embassy will be reassigned to other positions. If you're going to expand in Africa, if you're going to do what we want to do in Afghanistan, opening new posts in Asia, as we're committed to over the longer run, given the contraction of revenues, you've got to find it by making these sorts of
Are
choices.
there other cuts across Asia or the Pacific?
No,
Wait,
no, no,
Will
Julie,
DFAT face job cuts?
Hmm?
Will DFAT face further job cuts
no,
in this budget?
no. My understanding is that it won't.
Julia Bishop says that Labor has effectively ended the bipartisan support of increasing the foreign aid budget.
Well,
What do you say to that?
the opposition needs to make an explicit commitment here. When will they reach 0.5%? Do they give a commitment that aid will increase should they win the next election? I haven't seen that from them. And if so, by what amount? If so, by what amount? If they're critical of our priorities, what are their alternative priorities? I mean, we're now in this election, we're now moving well and truly into the election phase, and the opposition, when it comes to overseas development assistance, can't get away with saying they like the 0.5%, but can't tell you when they will get there.
Given DFAT's parlous budgetary position, have you rethought your opposition to the idea of a consular travel levy?
No, no, and it's not a parlous budgetary position at all. In fact, DFAT, the government is going to allocate in this budget $49.9 million over 7 years to construct a new, more secure High Commission in Kenya. That'll reflect Australia's expanding trade and investment links with Kenya and East Africa. The government will provide $215.9 million over 7 years to upgrade and replace the government's secure international communications network. That was a DFAT priority. I was briefed on it by Peter Varghese. It was very important that a commitment be made there, and it is. The government will commit $14.1 million over 4 years to continue DFAT's coordination role for the regional assistance mission to the Solomon Islands, Ramsay's being one of the most successful security and development operations anywhere in the world. And the funding will allow DFAT to continue coordinating Australia's leadership of Ramsay as the Solomon Islands continues its transition towards long-term stability. In addition to that, the government's going to invest $52.6 million over 3 years to construct secure, purpose-built residential accommodation in Kabul to provide a more manageable security environment for Australian staff working in Afghanistan. So the adjective parlous should be discarded and repudiated, torn up, stamped on.
The use of aid funding for our refugee program, now that we've done that...
Be more specific, not refugee program,
into our asylum,
onshore sustenance, in accordance with OECD guidelines and the practice of a raft of other OECD countries.
Now that we've done it, do you expect this to be something that continues for many years ahead?
And we can't speculate about budgets way out in the future, but obviously any minister in charge of ODA, would argue strongly against that reprioritisation. That would not come as a surprise to any of you.
Why would you argue against the reprioritisation then? If you say it's a legitimate use of our money, if you say it's completely in line with what the OECD...
Because I'm wanting to maximise money going on the ODA programs that excite me and interest me. But we're running a budget, and we're running a budget without doing the things on jobs and growth that a coalition government would do. And therefore, with the contraction of revenues, there must be some response. We are determined not to do what state coalition governments have done, which is slash jobs and growth. Hence the wise budgeting. But I got to say, in all this context, a very generous treatment of the ODA budget.
But if you're arguing against the use of money like this, or if you prefer not to see it going to that, aren't you, in a sense, admitting that it's against the spirit of our aid program?
No, no.
Senator Carr, can I just ask you a question on Pakistan on the elections?
Yes.
What do you make of Imran Khan's assertions that they weren't fair and free elections in Pakistan this weekend?
Well, we're not in a position to judge that, but we can say that to see a civilian government give way to a civilian government after an election is a gain for Pakistan. I would urge the new government to take a very keen and sensitive interest in the religious and ethnic violence that since the start of the year has claimed at least 200 lives in the country. We want to see a democratic and stable and economically developing Pakistan without religious ethnic violence. We think the aspirations of the people of Pakistan for democracy are the same as those around the world. in the Arab world, across Asia, right around the globe, and we hope that this is the start of a more robust democracy in that country, but one that respects the rights of religious and ethnic minorities in the country.
Senator Carr, can I ask about Fiji? It's been 6 months since you announced that Margaret Tooby was becoming our High Commissioner in Fiji. Fiji still hasn't let her in. Is the new era in Fiji-Australia relations over before it even began?
I don't think I claimed it was a new era when in June last year we said we'd exchange High Commissioners. If Fiji doesn't want to receive an Australian High Commissioner, that's their loss. We'll have Margaret Toomy, a qualified, a highly qualified and indeed distinguished diplomat working on other things. Fiji is diminished by not having an Australian High Commissioner there, as I and Foreign Minister Kumambola agreed in the middle of the year. If they don't want a High Commissioner, then that diminishes them, not us. Terrific, thank you.